Maybe I started off by saying, who wants to start my bidding somewhere in the room? And then I just wait because I'm not scared of silence on stage, which is a skill that's taken me a long time to get rid of.
Welcome to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses, and each week I talk with Olympians, pro athletes, TV stars, Grammy winners, best-selling authors, CEOs, and other high performers to uncover their success secrets. Every conversation is jam-packed with inspiration and actionable ideas we all can apply to our own lives, personally and professionally. Get ready for a behind-the-scenes look at the techniques, processes, and mindsets powering the world's most successful people. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Everybody Pulls the Tarp. This week, my guest is Lydia Fenet. Lydia is the world's leading charity auctioneer. And over the course of her career, she has totally reshaped the global fundraising landscape. Let me tell you a little bit about Lydia. Lydia's auctions have raised over $1 billion, and her work has supported more than 800 organizations worldwide. She got her start as an intern at Christie's auction house after finding a creative way to land an internship after initially getting rejected. Since then, Lydia has worked relentlessly to develop her craft and reach the top of her industry. She is now widely recognized for her poise and power on stage and has stood alongside celebrities like Bruce Springsteen, Elton John, and Jerry Seinfeld to raise record-breaking donations for some of the most notable charities globally. Lydia is the author of 2 best-selling books, the host of her own podcast called Claim Your Confidence, and she speaks all over the world on sales, empowering people in the workplace, and the art of public speaking. In the conversation you're about to hear, Lydia and I explore her remarkable journey from intern to the top of her profession. You'll hear actionable ideas on how to be more confident, ways to captivate an audience's attention, and so much more. One of the many reasons I was so excited to chat with Lydia is because skills that she has mastered over the course of her career, like building confidence, communicating value to others, and maximizing our impact, are universal skills that are critical in almost everything we do, personally and professionally. This was a really fascinating conversation, and I know I'll be thinking about it for a long time to come. I hope you take away as much from this one as I have. Oh, and one more thing. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended to be a substitute for the advice of a physician, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Lydia Fenet. Lydia, where I want to begin, I want to go back to your early career days and your path to becoming an auctioneer. You started working at Christie's auction house as an intern when in college, but like many success stories, it wasn't so simple and straightforward. You applied for the internship, you got rejected, they said it was full, and then you called the internship coordinator every day for the next couple of weeks and got an opportunity. Take me through that. Why did you have so much conviction to go work at Christie's in that internship program and in the auction industry in particular at that point of your life?
It's interesting. If I look backwards, I can pull a thread that starts at a very early age through current day. One thing I have always realized about myself is once I get a bee in my bonnet about something, it is absolutely unshakable, and I will eventually figure out a way to make it happen. So I didn't really know anything about the auction world growing up. My parents were not art collectors. I grew up in Louisiana where there really is no robust auction industry for art. And I was in college and I read an article in Vanity Fair magazine about Princess Diana's dresses being sold at a place called Christie's Auction House. And the article really captured my imagination. I read about this glamorous place on Park Avenue. All these people were going, they were interfacing with the bold-faced names and the rich and famous. And then they detailed a little bit about the people who worked there. And they said that they traveled internationally. And it was kind of everything I'd ever wanted out of life in one place. It wasn't even really, frankly, about the art. It was really about this environment and this auction world. And I just had to know more. And so I dug in a little bit more. I started talking to people about it. And I'm sure you know this as well as I do. And the beauty of networking is the more times you tell people, eventually in some way, it'll come back to you. And through that path, my father met someone who knew a girl who had started working at Christie's by chance earlier that year. And she gave me the internship coordinator's information. And I started calling. One thing about Louisiana, and now that I live in New York City, there's just a difference in the way that you understand how companies work at a very early age. I had no idea about internships. I didn't know that internship applications started sometimes as early as September, the year before summer. For me, it was sort of like, oh, I would just call someone and then talk to them, and maybe they would give me a job if I was nice and charming. So that was really my approach when I first called. I had my deep Southern accent at that point. It hadn't been ground down over years at New York City. And I called the internship coordinator expecting the answer to immediately be, yeah, of course, come work, as it would have been anywhere in Louisiana. And she just laughed out loud. It was sort of like, honey, the internship program has been full since January. It is the end of April. There are no internships available. And that completely threw me off guard. So we ended the conversation and I was sort of retreated. And I remember talking to my parents about it. And if you've read my books, you would know that a lot of my gumption comes from my father. My father is an attorney. He's relentless in his pursuit of whatever he wants. And he was like, well, just keep calling. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just keep calling. And so once I started calling and I got into it, I just realized that there was no way I was not going to let this happen. And so it did. It took about 2 weeks of calling. I'm old enough where there was a time when there was no caller ID. So she picked up every morning, not knowing that I was on the other line. I think now I would have been screened very well. But the amazing thing was that I've realized in life, if you ask the same question differently, or if you come up with a solution, sometimes you end up getting the better end of it. And so the last day of the questions, which ultimately yielded the yes, was me asking her, why is the internship program capped at 30 people, which she had mentioned many times over the course of the weeks. And she said, well, because all of the interns leave on Tuesdays and Thursdays to go to museum tours, and the docents will only take groups of 15. So we can't have more than 30. And that was my in, because as you remember from my conversation about reading that article, there was nothing about me that was dying to go to a museum. It was that I wanted to be at Christie's. And so I immediately said, well, listen, if all the interns are leaving, I'm sure people are still going to need work to get done. So I could just stay behind and do the work. I don't have to go to the museums. And I think she was just so relieved that an answer had been found that she offered the internship later that day. And so I was supposed to do a modified internship, but interns don't always show up for work. There was always space at the museum. So I got to go to pretty much every single museum trip. Plus I got an internship and I got my foot in the door, and that was the beginning.
I love that story, Lydia, because there's so much to it. There's persistence, right? There's creating your own opportunity. There's finding a solution for someone that was probably just open to solutions, right? You brought the solution to the internship coordinator. I'm reminded of a story. It's a different industry, but I'm reminded of a story that Edwin McCain, songwriter and famed singer Edwin McCain, once told me. Edwin is famous for a number of songs. One is I'll Be in the 90s, which was rated the number one wedding song and love song of the 90s. But he was almost out of business as a songwriter and recording artist because he had been signed to a record deal, which was facilitated a bit by his friends at Hootie and the Blowfish. But the record company came to Edwin at one point and said, Edwin, if you don't provide us some usable material in the next couple of weeks, this has been a couple of years at this point, we're going to move on. So Edwin writes the song, which ends up becoming I'll Be, on the back of a napkin. Takes him 15, 20 minutes to write this song that becomes such a huge hit. But he said, Andrew, I couldn't just put the song out there and record it and let it just happen. He said, I had a spiral notebook at the time, and I would call every single program director at radio stations all over the country every single morning, essentially begging them to play my song on the radio. And he said at one point, I think one of the guys just felt bad. And was like, if I don't put this song on the
thing, it's a real thing.
He said, if I don't put this song on the radio, this guy's going to call me again and again the next how many days? So he puts the song on the radio. It starts getting played a little bit more. Then Dawson's Creek decides to use it, and he's off to the races.
That's amazing.
Sometimes you have to create your own opportunities.
You have to create your own opportunities. And I also love the part of the story there that is about the work that he did to get there, because that's the invisible unknown in our day and age. That's the social media moment where someone's like, oh, that's kind of annoying that that person had all that success, where all that success came because he had the spiral notebook and he wrote down those producers' names and he called them and called them and called them. And those are the stories that are the most inspiring to me, because when I look around at my friends who've been the most successful, and even on my own podcast, when I have the conversations with people who are successful now, there are always those stories at the beginning. And that shows who the person is. If you're listening now and you're not that person, you can be that person. You just have to take that extra step.
Absolutely. You took the extra step. You've taken so many extra steps throughout your career. Let's continue on with the internship. So you get the internship, you get the opportunity. What do you remember most about the experience? Was it particularly jarring still for you because you're from Louisiana and now you're working at Christie's in New York? Take me through the internship experience. Now that you've got it.
Now that I've got it, I loved it. And honestly, it wasn't because I was doing anything glamorous. I was in charge of shredding all the paper for, at that time, there were just reams of paper that had to do with all the old sales. And I would just stand by the shredder at the elevator nonstop all day, every day. There was a guy who worked in the marketing team who called me the shredder. I'm almost 6 feet and I would be shredding literally reams of paper as tall as me all day. But I would just chat with anyone who came next to the elevator. And again, I just loved being part of this world. It was my exposure to the auction world itself, where I would get to go downstairs and watch the sales. I knew nothing about any of this, so it was all so new to me. And then there was living in New York. So it was just, in my opinion, like a buffet. It was like anything I could take, anything I would go after, I could have the access to. And, I was getting paid peanuts on the dollar. There was like no money coming in. So it was just being scrappy and fun and hardworking and saying yes to everything. And that really set me up for success at Christie's, because one thing I will say about the auction world, they will give you opportunities at any age. No one is looking at you saying like, oh, you're 22. There's no way you could do that. A lot of times people leave. And if you're the person standing there, they're like, hey, how about you? Like that is the process by which you get selected. And that kept happening to me even after the internship, because I kept showing up. I was always there, always asking for more. And because I was always asking for more, I was always being given more. And so it ended up being a great thing that really worked out for me and still to this day does.
And as I understand your career story and trajectory, that's kind of how you got into actually being an auctioneer, right? I mean, this is something that you were doing at Christie's on top of your air quote day job. And how did you make that transition from working at Christie's in the office as the shredder to actually being an auctioneer on a stage somewhere?
Well, it's amazing because I always think that sort of intersection of timing and hard work is the perfect way to describe my career time and time again. So I was in the internship, I was hired out of my internship, and I went to work in the special events department, which is where I had done my internship. And I absolutely loved the events department because, as I said, I was there 24/7. There are so many opportunities to entertain clients there. And there's such a small team that you literally work all day and you work until at least 8 o'clock most nights, if not later, because of the dinners. And one of the things you get to do in special events is accompany the auctioneers out into New York City. So I'll take you back. I'm in my 40s now, but at that point I was 21 years old. I was making literally no money. And the opportunity would come to us that we could go to these huge galas somewhere in New York City and accompany the auctioneer and be the spotters. So we were the people in the room screaming bidding or sir, so that the person knew that there was a guy in the back corner who'd had 15 drinks and wanted to bid. And for me, that was just the most exciting thing in the world. I mean, it was being in the center of New York City society, seeing everything I'd ever wanted to see in New York taking place. It's like something out of a movie. And I was getting to do that after my day job. So we would work all day and then we would go out to these galas with the auctioneers. But one thing I realized pretty quickly, I wanted to be on that stage. I wanted to be the auctioneer up there. And another thing that I realized at that time was that the art auctioneers who worked at Christie's were probably like 95% guys. It's just the way that the company was at that time. Again, I was starting in the 2000s. Up until 2020 at Christie's, there was not a male auctioneer on the stage for the main evening sale from 1766 when the auction house was started. So it was very, like the guys were at the top. And I say that with such love because I love them all. And I had loved working with them. And that is not a dig at anyone. It is just, I'm telling you what was in front of me. But what I could see very clearly was that the main role was never going to be taken by a woman in those evening sales, as long as I was going to be there, as far as I could tell. But the charity auctioneering world was kind of whatever. No one really took it that seriously. People kind of did it on the fly. And at that time, you had to be an officer in the company. So pretty much all the charity auctioneers were guys as well, because to be an officer, you had to have been there for long enough and you had to be established enough that you could become an officer. And so we would go out night after night. And about 4 years into my career, a lot of the auctions that were taken by charity auctioneers, they just like didn't really care about it. It was kind of like a stepsister of the art auction. So they just didn't show up. or they would be too hungover, or they just really didn't show up in a way that they needed to show up. And they kind of recognized that as well. It was sort of like nobody really wanted to do it. So they opened up the tryouts for the first time to the entire company. And I really saw that as my moment. I had seen this from watching it as an audience member many times over 4 years. And I went down and I got on stage and I kind of did exactly what I'd seen them do time and time again. And it's a 4-day tryout, or it was at that point. And I like to say it's a little bit like Survivor. You get voted off the island. And so the first day, it was like my boss's boss got fired. And then the second day, it was my boss who, not fired, but like was let go from the
Let go from the island.
We were like over the island. They were no longer on the island. It was just us. And at that point, it became clear by day 4 that I was going to be in the final group. And I was the only girl. I was at that point, probably 10 to 15 years younger than most of the other people they were passing. And they passed me by saying, listen, we don't really know what we're going to do with you, but you have something on stage. So we'll just send you to the auctions that nobody wants to take.
So they sent you to Kansas City, right?
Kansas City, off I went. And that was when I talk about that hard work intersection. It was like, I had my hand up within 10 seconds. They're like, who wants to go to Kansas? Before they could even say Kansas City. I was like, I'll go. It was January. It was freezing. I walked in. They were just like, who is this person? Like, this is not who we thought was going to be our auctioneer. They were clearly upset. But I'd done so much studying. I feel like I got in there and they were like, okay, she seems legit. And I mean, I got up there and it was probably the most embarrassing, horrible auction I've ever taken, although there have been many, so I can't say that with 100% assurance. But I started the auction. I hit the gavel against the podium. The gavel head snapped off and rolled underneath the podium. And the thing about charity auctioneering is you don't have a lot of time to really get an audience involved. And so by the time I got up, everyone was talking and had turned away from the stage. They were also all standing, which as a charity auctioneer, I can tell you is like the death of an auction. You never want to take an auction as a charity auctioneer where people aren't seated because they don't want to pay attention. So it was like a slog. I wanted to crawl out of there on my hands and knees, or maybe even army style, just so no one would see me. I don't even think they said thank you. I just left. But it was something about that night that I always love something where I'm like, I feel like I could get better at this if I just tried, if I just practiced. And there were a ton of auctions that nobody else wanted to take. And that's really where it started for me. I mean, I was on stage that first year, maybe 50 times, and then it was 60 times and then 70 and 80 and 100. And it was always after work. So I was working all day and then I had this night job. My friends got very used to me saying, listen, I can meet you for water before, I can meet you for dessert after, but I can never be around from about 7:30 to 9:30. And that has become my full-time job now.
Lydia, I am curious, when you think back to that first night in Kansas City, you smack the gavel down and it falls off. And you talked about like it being your worst auction ever. But I have to believe that at that moment, there were skills that you had that you knew if you developed and you put time in, that you could turn those into something really special like you have. So take me through, like, for everybody listening, for anybody who's never been to an auction, who has no idea what an auctioneer does, what were some of the skills that you felt like in that moment you had that you could develop? And what were some of the skills that you knew that like maybe you didn't have that you would need to develop from scratch to become, the auctioneer that you eventually have become, raising over $1 billion for more than 800 organizations worldwide? You've stood on stages alongside celebrities like Bruce Springsteen, Hugh Jackman, Jerry Seinfeld, and so many others. Take me through like the skill set assessment at that moment in Kansas City. What did you have? What did you need to build?
Well, I was probably crying, so it would have taken a day or two for me to really come back from that. But what I had was the technical skills, because that's what I had been taught at Christie's. And over 4 years, I'd been the phone bidder who was bidding on behalf of a client while the auctioneer was taking the auction. So I had seen enough auctions, art auctions, to know what that meant. And so what I would say on stage and what I defaulted to immediately was, okay, I'm going to do exactly what I saw all these guys do. So I'm going to be a British guy. Like, I put on a British accent. I was using words like shall, words that are really not words that you use in common language, but you use them in the auction world because you're selling things of such gravitas, right? So it's supposed to seem very elegant and professional. And that's really what I defaulted to. And those were the skills that I knew I could get better at. What took me really a decade to understand was that what was going to eventually be the differentiator with my auctioneering style and what has eventually made me as successful as I have in this career is that in the charity auctioneering world, which if you've never been to an auction, I'll explain this very quickly for you. In the art auctioneering world, you walk into a well-lit sales room where hundreds of people are seated in front of an auctioneer they don't make a sound. The auctioneer has increments that are mathematically correct. Everybody knows exactly what those increments are. Everyone knows what is going on, why they're there, and what they're bidding on. What you're hoping for is that people get carried away or they love something so much that they pay more than you thought they were going to. In a charity auction, you're walking into a room late in the evening. Usually people have already had an hour cocktail reception and they're seated for a 2+ hour dinner. They probably don't know that there's an auction. If they do, they definitely don't want there to be an auction. So your style and what I was doing for those first 10 years technically was correct. I had taken my art auctioneering and I was putting it on stage. Why it wasn't working was because charity auctioneering is not art auctioneering. I'm not going to a friendly crowd who's waiting for me to give them things to bid on. I'm going to a bunch of people who are probably a little drunk, who are having fun and don't want anyone else talking on stage and see me as the only person that it's actually okay for them to talk over. So what happened about 10 years in was that I realized that where I was going to be successful was I was going to use the technical skills that I had, but also use an entertainment quotient that you couldn't use on stage as an art auctioneer. And that for me came in the form of humor. I've always had a very dry sense of humor. I've always loved sort of cracking jokes, unpacking jokes, creating jokes out of thin air. And that's really what started to happen for me on stage. And I realized when that happened that people would stop talking because they wanted to hear what I had to say. And so now I really treat it as almost like an elevated improv dinner show where people just happen to shell out millions of dollars. And because they're entertained and they want to hear what's next, they stop talking and they pay attention. And so those technical skills aided me, but also held me back in many ways because I think I was trying so hard to be this elderly British gentleman that was so refined, when in fact, I can still be refined, but be fun and entertaining and young and funny and wear crazy, beautiful dresses and huge earrings and heels and make it my own thing. And that ultimately has been the differentiator for me.
All right, everyone. We'll get back to the conversation momentarily. But first, I want to tell you about my free weekly email newsletter, Tarp Pullers. Each week, I share an uplifting and inspirational tarp pulling story that is sure to brighten your day. And I also highlight some of the most powerful ideas I've learned on my journey talking to 200 and counting of the world's top performers. The newsletter is short, concise, and a reader recently told me this. She said it makes her day every time it hits her inbox. Go to everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter to sign up today. So Lydia, at a charity auction dinner, once you have their attention, maybe it's that humor, maybe it's something like you described, how do you keep their attention?
It's all about the audience. What I've learned in charity auctioneering is that the actual auctioneering portion is secondary to what I do with the crowd. So if I walk into a crowded room and I start spouting off the numbers, a vacation home in Mexico, let's say it's a $20,000 value for a week. This is a spectacular home. And I bullet out exactly what that house is. And then I turn to the audience and I say, we'll start the bidding at $2,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. And it gets boring quickly. And if you don't have $20,000 to spend, you're not going to pay attention. So what I am trying to do for the room is to create a visual for the people who are not going to be bidding to understand why they should be paying attention. So maybe I started off by saying, who wants to start my bidding somewhere in the room? And then I just wait because I'm not scared of silence on stage, which is a skill that's taken me a long time to get rid of. I'm not scared of any audience. I'm not scared of them at all. And so me sitting in silence makes them uncomfortable. And eventually somebody will bid. So you might raise your hand, Andy, and I would say to you, sir, in the black t-shirt, reminiscent of Johnny Cash, sitting over here on my left, looks like a musical figure, probably a billionaire from all of his time spent on air. So where are we going to start my bidding? I should remind you that I worked at Christie's for 2 decades, so make sure it's a good number. And then I just let that sit in a room of 500 people. And if you were about to say $50, you're about to say $1,000, promise you. And so that's essentially how my charity auctioneering works. It has very little to do with what I'm selling because honestly, at the top level of these charity auctions, the people who are buying to give to the nonprofit. They sometimes don't even use the houses that they buy. That's the truth. So this is an opportunity for them to, support their cause, to get other people to bid and to give money. And I am the conduit for that. So as long as they're having fun and they don't feel like people are looking at them being like, this is a gross amount of money that they spend, they're going to keep going. And there's always a point where they start to pull back. There's always a point where I start to push forward, but that's how I keep a crowd engaged.
How did you ultimately get comfortable with that silence, like you described?
I realized how powerful it was on stage. if everybody is talking like crazy and I can't get them to stop, me yelling louder does not help. Me saying to the audience, which is something that I often do, ladies and gentlemen, could you just shush yourselves? And then I just wait and they do it. And I'll say something like, this is so puzzling because obviously you like to talk, but I like to talk more and I have a microphone. So why don't you give me 10 minutes of your time and I'll get this done? And so that silence for me is also really incredible because you've already heard how much I talk. I mean, I probably have talked more than any of your guests in the allotted amount of time that you've given me. And I speak very quickly. So what is it that makes them look, if I'm talking and talking and talking, when I stop talking? Because they might be like, oh, is this over? Thank God. Or wait, what is she doing now? Or wait, why is it quiet all of a sudden? And so especially in the paddle raise moment at the end of a charity auction, which is the moment where it's just a cash call, I'm saying to the audience, who would like to start me off by giving a generous donation of $25,000? If I jump in and start talking like $25,000 could blah, blah, blah. If I just sit with that and there's anyone in that room who will give it, they will give that money then. And I might throw something in like, not all heroes wear capes. Sit with silence, like a joke every couple of minutes. And then eventually I'll watch people as their hands sort of like move towards the paddle on the table. And I'll say, sir, I can see your hand moving towards the paddle. So whether or not he intended to do it, he's going to do it then because 500 people are looking at him. So I would say that like anything, I can make these jokes because frankly, I've spent 23 years on stage and I do it sometimes 80, 90, 100 nights a year. But the thing about public speaking that makes you a good public speaker, which is counterintuitive because everybody is scared of public speaking, is to speak in public. So if you have that fear or you don't think you can do it, just keep doing it because I promise you, it's like anything else. The more you do it, the adrenaline starts to subside. You understand what that feels like. And eventually it gets really fun. I mean, I'll be at weddings and people are like, do you want to give a toast? I'm like, I don't know them, but okay. It's like, just give me a microphone and an elevated platform and I'll come up with something, I promise.
Lydia, where I want to go next, in addition to your works as an auctioneer and all your public speaking, you have taken the lessons that you have learned and you have crystallized them to try and share these lessons with so many other people. You're the author of 2 books, The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You, and Claim Your Confidence. When did you start to realize that some of these things that you were learning that were helping you to develop your craft were also going to be useful to others?
A lot of times when I get off stage, I would say 8 out of every 10 auctions, there's someone waiting to tell me how they can't public speak. And I would say 7 to 8 out of those 10 people are women. And I remember thinking to myself, when I would get off stage, people would like, oh, you're such a natural. And I would just laugh and be like, no one is a natural at this. I mean, I got beaten on stage for 10 years before I got to a place where I could walk off stage and feel confident that I had done a good job. 10 years. And so I started thinking to myself, if you can learn something, you can usually teach it. And I've always been a writer. I mean, I have so many shelves of books on my computers over the years. I don't even know where they are, but I love to write. And I have a best friend who had written her first book. And in New York, it's interesting because you're surrounded by such incredibly dynamic people. In particular, for me, I find I have this incredible community of women. You get to a certain point in your career and you start looking around and you realize that a lot of the people who've taken the next step in their career have written a book and established themselves as an authority on something. And so those 2 things for me were coming to a head at the same time. I had been at Christie's for almost maybe 16, 17 years at that point. So I started telling people I was thinking about writing a book and everyone's like, oh, that's great. What are you going to write a book about? I'm like, no idea. Like, I really have no idea. Then there was a moment, and we go back to that working hard and that amazing sort of moment where it all intersects with the right timing. And I was being interviewed by the New York Times for a day in the life piece where they were going to follow me around because I was still doing my 2 jobs. I had just added 3 children on top of it. So, from a working woman's perspective, I mean, one of the nicest things, and I can say this having worked for my entire career, is seeing women ahead of you who continue leaning into jobs, who continue doing things as they're having children, not even because they are, but as they are having children. And you're sort of like, wait, I could do that. She's doing that. That's possible. What does that take? And so being able to share that with people for me became a passion too. I used to nurse in front of my team because it was all women. And I was like, guys, you're going to have to pump at some point if you have kids. And I just want you to see how horrible this is, but just know you can do it and just don't worry about it. just stop worrying about it. Like I would do transatlantic flights and do it and then tell them about it so that they saw it too. And so all of these lessons for me were things that I wanted to be able to share. And in that Day of the Life piece in New York, it was really that was the intent, to show how having 3 children, going to an office, coming home, going back out on stage, coming home again, all of those things could be done. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of systems in place. And so all of those things were in that article. And the last thing that the reporter asked me at the end of the night, and I had actually written it before my third child, I was being interviewed before my third child was born. And so I was pregnant. And she said, what do you do when you go home? And I always seize the opportunity. I mean, it's like I will paint myself into a corner until there is nothing left and then just take a leap. And I said to her, I either read a book or I write this book that I'm writing. I mean, I was barely writing a book. I'd written maybe one chapter that my best friend's agent had told me, this is not the book you should write, but you do have a book in you. It's just not this one. But then nothing happened. I told the New York Times the piece didn't come out. I had my third child. And then 6 months passed. And again, timing, such an important piece of it. They sent me the transcript of what they were going to run. And I saw that I had said that about the book. And I called my best friend and I said, what do I do? And she said, you write a proposal. You've got to write your proposal now. And I had 6 weeks before the piece ran. And I did. I sat down. I write very well on planes. And I wrote what is the first chapter of my book. It's called The Strike Method, because I kept thinking to myself, like, how do I bring someone into this crazy world? And it was really about me backstage, thinking about, I was about to go on stage. What do I think about? Like, what are the keys to getting out on that stage and feeling confident? And so it's Lydia, you're on in 10 seconds is the opening line of the book. And I wrote that on a plane. And so that proposal, I remember sending to my best friend's agent, and she was like, this is it. Like, this is your book. And the New York Times piece came out 2 weeks after the Harvey Weinstein piece was sort of out. And all of a sudden, Me Too exploded. And every publishing house wanted a book about powerful women in executive jobs and the lessons they'd learned. So again, you've got to do the work, but God, if you're there when the timing hits and you're there and you're ready, that's when it all explodes. And honestly, Andy, that book completely changed the trajectory of my career. I could have been a senior executive at Christie's my entire career. I could have gone on to another corporate job and another corporate job. But I look back on that moment and it was almost like they're 2 parallel roads. And all of a sudden I was on a completely different path, seeing founders and all of these speaking engagements and all the things that you do and I do that are so exciting if that's what you love to do, and the ability to train people and teach people. And that for me, all of a sudden became my new path, and the path that ultimately I followed and led me to start my own auctioneering agency.
So what's 1 or 2 things, Lydia, that somebody listening who doesn't feel completely confident, or they're experiencing some imposter syndrome and they want to do something that they're not doing today? What's 1 or 2 things that Lydia Fenet says, this is how you do it? Other than just getting out and doing it, right? We've already talked about, like, the best way to become a public speaker is to speak publicly.
Yes. So I would say to everyone who's out there right now, if there is something that's really burning inside of you, sit down with a piece of paper, write down at this moment in your life, every single thing you know how to do, like everything you know how to do. And then put the piece of paper away, come back to it later in the day, and cross off everything you don't want to do anymore. Like every single thing that you wish you did not have to do anymore, and see what is still on that piece of paper, because that is your passion and that's where your energy should lie. And then make up a story about who you are based on what you want to do. So I wrote The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You as the title of a book. The most amazing thing that I realized was that I became known as a powerful woman. I was asked to speak at Power Women Summits as a result of that book. Who told them I was powerful? I told them I was powerful by writing that book. Did I feel that way when I started the book? No. But did I feel that way by the time I ended it and had spoken in public and had done a million speeches 6 years later? Yeah, I really do. So I would say to you now, whatever you want to do, you have to create the script for your own life and start using those words about yourself. Because when you tell people what you want to do, they will help you get there. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to know where you're headed. And if you know where you're headed, that's when people start to come into your path that will lead you to the next spot. And that is the truest thing I can tell anyone who's listening right now. You are the architect of your own life. No one's going to do it for you. But if you set up your life, others will come in and help you.
Lydia, I'm curious. I've asked this question to so many people over the years. Do you think of yourself more as somebody who likes to prove people right or somebody who likes to prove people wrong? In other words, Are you more interested and more motivated to prove the people who might doubt you that you can do it? Or are you more motivated to prove those people that believe in you that they're right?
I think a little bit of both. There's certainly people over the course of my career who've said to me, one person in particular, I can remember when I told them that I wanted to be a keynote speaker because I'd heard about this industry and I'd started digging in and I'd read about Sheryl Sandberg and her speaking fees were insane. And I was like, this is an amazing career. I feel like this is something I could do. And I remember he said to me in front of a whole table of people, yeah, but she's Sheryl Sandberg. And I said, yeah, but she wasn't on anyone's radar until she wrote Lead In. That was what put her on the map, right? So she created this whole path and avenue for her. So I feel like in that way, sometimes I want to prove people wrong. But I also think not necessarily even proving people right. I think if you take people along on your journey, like if people are invested in you because you're invested in them, it becomes almost like a cheering squad. When my friends are succeeding, nothing makes me happier. Like you don't get more texts from anyone but me if things are going well for you, because I know how hard it is when things are going right. And everyone's kind of like, oh, that's awesome, but kind of annoying because it's not me. So much better to be with a person who's like in a good place on their own, who's just cheering alongside you. So I think both.
Biggest area of opportunity for professional growth for you, even with all the success that you've achieved, Lydia, what's the biggest area of professional growth for you?
There's so many. Okay, I'm going to do this quickly for you. I sold my first book to Hulu in December, and I'm an executive producer on the project. So that for me opens up a completely different avenue of exciting opportunities. But speaking, I think that's an area that I can continue to really grow. I'm launching a new podcast this year, which I'm excited about as well. And finally, the auctioneering agency for me is the most exciting because that's the thing I can do for the rest of my life. I can continue to be on stage. And when I can't be there, I can put really talented auctioneers that I've trained on stage in my place. So that for me also helps the nonprofits, which is really exciting.
If someone were to write a book about you, Lydia, what would you want them to say? What would you want the story to tell?
First and foremost, I would want it to say that everyone knew that there was nothing more important to me than my family, my kids, my husband, my parents, my siblings. Like that is the core of who I am. And that's why I am who I am. But I would also love for them to just say that she was fearless. Like she wasn't scared of trying anything, because that's honestly how I feel at this point in my career. And I feel like my career is just getting started. Is that weird? Do you feel the same way I say that to people?
No, every day I feel that way. I'm reminded of a story. I can't remember if it was in Bruce Springsteen's memoir, if it was in a documentary about Bruce Springsteen that I watched at some point, but I remember, this was in the last 15 years. Bruce Springsteen tells a story about Clarence Clemens in the E Street Band getting onto the plane after a major stop on the tour. He essentially calls a toast and he says, I think this is the start of something big.
And everyone's like, you are big.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just always stuck with me. Like no matter where you are, today could be the start of something big. And in many ways, I feel like I'm still just getting started in chapter 1. And I know that you feel the same way. As we get ready to wrap up our conversation, in terms of that idea of being fearless, how can people overcome those fears, right? Like you've got that list that you described and you've crossed off the things that you don't want to do. You've identified the things that give you energy, but how do you overcome that fear?
Yeah. What I think is the biggest barrier to entry for all of us is what other people think about what we're doing. If we're honest, right? You don't try things because you're scared it's not going to work out. There's an ultra marathoner named Courtney Dauwalter who I follow obsessively because of my sister who's a runner. And I had the opportunity to interview her on the podcast. And after we got off, there was a phrase that came to me, and I made it my New Year's resolution last year. And since the beginning of the year, you guys can use it if you want. It's been the greatest New Year's resolution ever. Find fun in failure. Meaning, don't just go for things that you think you're going to do okay in. Like go in with such a big swing that you probably are not going to be able to do it. And you know that. Because what you want to do is almost make yourself like feel as if you don't care what the outcome is as long as you try. And if you go into something big and you fail, tell everyone about it. I started my second book, Claim Your Confidence, with a story about 4 people showing up at book signing. 4 people. At one point, it was one person. I had to recruit the rest of the people from the bookstore. But I started with that story. I'd started the story arc with this like amazing day in San Francisco where I'd had 2 weeks of unbelievable book signings in New York City. It was the moment of my life. And then I get to San Francisco, I'm like, you're getting sick of this perky perfectionism? Don't worry, it's about to take a real U-turn. And I describe what it's like to walk into your book signing. And it's, by the way, a moderated conversation. So there was someone who was going to be asking me questions for one person. And telling that story for me, I didn't tell it at the beginning, like when I first told people about that book signing. And then I was like, what am I telling people if I can't tell them the truth about the bad parts? And what I realized is like, that's the part that's fun, right? That failure is more fun for people to hear because everyone's been through something like that. So don't hide your failures because then you won't fear them. Like, what do you care? You know, if I do a retreat and no one shows up, I'll be like, well, next time maybe people will come. You can't fear it because if you don't try it, you're never going to know. So you might as well do it. Find fun in failure.
Find the fun in failure. So beautifully said, Lydia. I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I could ask you questions all day. I know you and I are both passionate about learning from the world's most successful people, honing our crafts, and sharing what we learn with others. Lydia, this has been so much fun. There is no question that in my mind that you are a tarp puller, certified member of the Everybody Pulls Tarp community.
Oh, so honored.
You do the nitty gritty. You have the work ethic to do whatever it takes, and you're lifting others up along the way. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this week. All right, Lydia, we'll have to do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Andy.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Instagram at AndrewMoses123 and sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Until next time, keep pulling the tarp.